I should have up here. And we can kind of talk about them directly. So, there's no sound. No sound. Hold on. Oh, can you hear it now? All good? Oh, okay. Weird. I have to go check that other one. Anyway, I was just saying that this is just something that I do. Not so recently. I haven't done it so much, but I'm just gonna read along. I read along to some stuff that I think is interesting. Usually, I've assigned it to a class that I have. And if you're seeing the VOD or if you're seeing the YouTube version of this, if you come to live stream, the benefit that you get is that you can ask a question, and hopefully, this stuff can make a little bit more sense to you. Tonight, we're looking at, because I'm teaching a class called The Principles of Argumentation, and I've decided, I've kind of resisted this text for a long time, and I've come around on it a little bit, because I think it's a good place to start. It's where, one thing I did before the stream is I was looking at some historical reviews of this work, which I thought, I'll look at a couple of them before we get started reading it, that I thought were pretty interesting. Because this is a work, it comes out in, I should know, it should say it in one of the reviews. I think it was 58, yeah. 58 or 57, either way. It came out in the 50s, and it's by this guy, Stephen Toulmin, who was a philosopher. And he mostly did work previous to this in the philosophy of science and in ethics. And here he's kind of apparently going into logic, or what he's calling logic. But in some sense, he's trying to change what logic looks like or what it means. And that's kind of what this book is about. But it became a really popular book to the point that I can show you this if you just Googled the Toulmin model, if you spell it this way, not like Tim the Toolman, the Toulmin model, you get tons and tons and tons of stuff. A lot of writing centers have this. That's what's SEO optimized for me anyway. Claim, grounds, warrant, qualifier, this kind of stuff. Actually, this one's not too bad. Some of them are kind of like, I don't even know what they're talking about. They don't really look like anything like what Toulmin's writing about. But this is kind of what the Toulmin model looks like. Claim, there are dogs nearby. Grounds, you kind of start, it's kind of like Arabic or Hebrew. You start from the right if you're trying to reconstruct what's going on. And the arrows go in different directions and stuff. It can be kind of confusing. So what's this big fuss about? Why is this so important? That's what we're going to look at tonight when we read this chapter. Because really when people are talking about the Toulmin method or the model, they're really only talking about one chapter from this book that was really important historically, and that's the chapter we're going to look at tonight, the layout of arguments. But, I read all of these things that people said about the book. Some of them were pretty funny. This one I thought would be funny to look at. The uses of argument is not easy reading. There are two main reasons for this. This is how philosophers write. There are two reasons. First, it is written in a maddening style. The prolix, sophisticated, conversational manner currently affected by the philosophical avant-garde. Damn. Brutal. Secondly, valuable suggestions are left undeveloped and lost in a wordy pursuit of trivialities. Okay, so not everybody was a big fan of this book. Actually, a lot of these reviews, I thought they were going to be all really negative. But some of them were pretty positive. Some of them were like, he doesn't go far enough. Doesn't really take what the thing he's saying far enough. So what's he really doing here? We're going to find out about it as we read it, but I thought I might give a little bit of a background to help you get some sense of why this matters at all. If you were to study argument in the university in this time, you probably would be taking a logic course, and that's still true. A lot of logic courses will talk about arguments. Arguments is a kind of term of art there, depending on if you're doing propositional calculus or first-order predicate logic or any of the kind of logical languages that you'll learn in a logic class. They'll talk about, they'll be like, this is an argument. And you'll just be like, it is? I don't know what it means. There's a bunch of symbols, squiggly lines. And that was a way of studying deductive argument. And that was the kind of argument that was almost exclusively studied by philosophers. And Toulmin and a lot of other people were kind of realizing, people who were following Wittgenstein at one point, who's this weird Viennese guy, had kind of realized, well, they were really interested in science. As I said, he was a philosopher of science. He's like, stuff doesn't really work for scientific reasoning. And so every time an argument fails to be deductive, they were just like, it's inductive. And he's like, yeah, but there's like way more going on, because he was also looking at ethics. He's like, there's just way more stuff going on than just calling it inductive. We're not really studying the stuff of what he calls substantial arguments. So he makes this distinction between analytical arguments, which are basically arguments that you got everything you need. It's all right there. It's just, you just follow, if you know how to dot your I's and follow the method, you have it all right there. There's a little bit more to it than that. But yeah, that's deductive argument. All men are mortal. Socrates is a man. Socrates is mortal. That kind of stuff. He was interested in what he called substantive argument, where you don't necessarily have you don't have certainty. You have probability in making this inference. So that's what he's talking about. So here in the layout of arguments, he's trying to talk about, which I don't think is the most interesting chapter in the book, personally. I actually really like this stuff about force and fields and weird other concepts. It sounds like Star Wars when I talk about it that way. But I thought it would be good to look at this because it's a good beginner place for thinking about, if we're finding arguments in the world, well, how might we kind of talk about the parts of them? Okay, so anyway, enough preamble. An argument is like an organism. It has both a gross anatomical structure and a finer, as it were, physiological one. Now, I don't want to stop at every single sentence, but that's already a pretty interesting one to me. Because if you think about this, these analogies of like anatomy and physiology, which come from medicine, from the history of medicine in some sense, have long been these kinds of background metaphors. The anatomy of something would be like a kind of really detailed analysis or dissection of a subject. The anatomy of melancholy, or the anatomy of the mind, or things like that. It's a metaphor, but the idea being we're going to lay out every single part. But what's one of the things about anatomy? It's all of the dead parts. It's not the thing as it's alive, right? You can't really cut something open when it's alive. Well, people do that, but you shouldn't. That's not good, right? And then physiology is like the movement of a living being, right? So how do you study that stuff? It's a lot harder. Now we have fMRIs and stuff, and you can have dye tests, and you maybe can actually image the body and its physiological movement. But you have to know what it is that you're looking for and all that kind of stuff. So that's what he's kind of talking about, is the distinction between the anatomical part, which is where we're like, here are the parts of it when the thing is kind of dead and laid out, when we're kind of looking at it frozen, versus all the stuff that's happening to it when it's live. When set out explicitly in all its detail, it may occupy a number of printed pages or may take a quarter of an hour to deliver. And within this time or space, one can distinguish the main phases marking the progress of the argument from the initial statement of an unsettled problem to the final presentation of a conclusion. These main phases will each of them occupy some minutes or paragraphs, and so represent the chief anatomical units of the argument, its organs, so to speak. So let's say you listen to a speaker, you listen to a debate, and it takes 30 minutes. Hopefully the recap of it doesn't take 30 minutes. It probably takes 70 minutes, like a lot of recap podcasts of TV shows. No, it should be, you'd be like, well, here are the parts of the argument. What's the outline? What's the skeleton, we say, right? That's the anatomical part. But within each paragraph, when one gets down to the level of individual sentences, a finer structure can be recognized. And this is the structure with which logicians have mainly concerned themselves. It is at this physiological level that the idea of logical form has been introduced. And here that the validity of our arguments has ultimately to be established or refuted. And I find this to be like a really weird thing that he begins with, actually. Because the thing that, to me, what it looks like he's doing is super anatomical. It's like, here are all the parts. But for him, because it's like, it's not a whole speech, it's just it's down to these little individual sentences. Because it's looking at a really small part of it, it's physiological. I don't think that's a right use of the metaphor. I think it's an interesting one. I think it's kind of wrong, but it's an interesting place to begin. So for him, this is what he's kind of trying to distinguish. Maybe a kind of rhetorical backdrop for him is the anatomical thing. Oh, you had your intro, and then you had, you had three main points. He's not talking about that part when he's talking about the physiology of the argument. The time has come to change the focus of our inquiry. And if you're here and you want to just drop in a question or talk about something, let me know. And we'll chat about it. This is very informal. The time has come to change the focus of our inquiry and to concentrate on this finer level. And he's referring to, the time in the book. It's chapter 3. He's been talking about other stuff. Yet we cannot afford to forget what we have learned about the study of the grosser anatomy of arguments. For here, as with organisms, the detailed physiology proves most intelligible when expounded against a background of coarser anatomical distinctions. Physiological processes are interesting not least for the part they play in maintaining the functions of the major organs. Blood's got to get into your organs or they're going to die, stuff like that. And micro-arguments, as one may christen them, need to be looked at from time to time with one eye on the macro-arguments in which they figure, since the precise manner in which we phrase them and set them out, to mention only the least important thing, may be affected by the role they have to play in the larger context. So one way you might think about this, if you're kind of just thinking about, well, how does this look in my life? Might be this thing when we talk about, well, what's your opinion or your position on, let's say, student loan forgiveness? Or what's your opinion on abortion? You kind of might broadly have in your mind a kind of vague heat map of the kind of positions that exist out there. Maybe it just breaks down into pro and con, but maybe there's a few more. And maybe you kind of have a basic sense of what the issues are that are there. But when people actually go and inhabit that position, even if they have the same position, some people might make an argument that's kind of more compelling or has better evidence than somebody else. So that might be this kind of more micro moment that he's talking about. When people actually inhabit those places, the actual sentences, the actual kinds of phrasing that they use, how does that all work? In the inquiry which follows, we shall be studying the operation of argument sentence by sentence in order to see how their validity or invalidity is connected with the manner of laying them out, and what relevance this has to the traditional notion of logical form. Certainly, the same argument may be set out in quite a number of different forms, and some of these patterns of analysis will be more candid than others. Candid here just kind of means like open or obvious or clear. Some of them, that is, that will show the validity or invalidity of an argument more clearly than others, and make more explicit the grounds it relies on and the bearing of these on the conclusion. So it's worth maybe stopping here and talking a little bit about validity and invalidity. So the logicians that Toulmin's kind of writing to, it's kind of his audience, are extremely concerned with validity and invalidity of an argument. So if you study the logical forms of, let's say, syllogisms, you learn forms of the syllogism that lead to a valid conclusion, a valid inference, and some that would lead to an invalid one. These are fallacies or sophismata or various kinds of broken or weak syllogistic forms that exist. And because of that, the logicians basically are not necessarily concerned with whether the thing is true or false in terms of does it describe the world. They're just saying, if we assume that these things are true, these premises are true, can we get to the conclusion? Does it follow? That's kind of what validity is. So validity is not the same thing as truth. It really has more to do with inference, how we get to a conclusion in an argument. How then should we lay out an argument if we want to show the sources of its validity? And in what sense does the acceptability or unacceptability of arguments depend upon their formal merits and defects? So that's what this chapter is going to be about. We have before us two rival models, one mathematical, the other jurisprudential. And I would say in almost all of the reviews of the book, this is how they characterize his entire project. They're like, for him, the model of argument is jurisprudential, not mathematical. Jurisprudence is maybe not, the most familiar idea or familiar word that you might have come across. But it's related to law, you might say, but it's not the same thing as legal argument. Jurisprudence is kind of a kind of discourse or practice that makes judgments about what is legal or illegal. It might kind of be part of the law, or might be part of the operation of the law. Maybe kind of, in an American context, you might think more about the Supreme Court and kind of constitutional interpretation, these kind of jurisprudential. Does this case fit the law? Well, how do we make that determination? What kinds of arguments do we need to make? What kinds of criteria do we use to determine those kinds of things? So he's, in some sense, I would say, he's really thinking a lot about stuff that for rhetoricians would be very familiar as enthymematic arguments. But for him, he kind of takes this model from law, which is an interesting thing. Why law? Why jurisprudence? He doesn't really say why. He just thinks it's better. So, is the logical form of a valid argument something quasi-geometrical, comparable to the shape of a triangle or the parallelism of two straight lines? Right? If you're trying to talk about your political opinions, can you like make a little geometrical diagram about them? Probably not. Right? Or alternatively, is it something procedural? Is a formally valid argument one in proper form, as lawyers would say, rather than one laid out in a tidy and simple geometrical form? Or does the notion of a logical form somehow combine both these aspects, so that to lay out an argument out in proper form necessarily requires the adoption of a particular geometrical layout? So here, I mean, right now, it might not be so clear what's the difference between proper and geometrical. But geometrical, again, is that idea of necessary inference, things necessarily following. There might be a way that you kind of fill out a form, let's say a piece of paperwork. You can do it properly and improperly. Doesn't necessarily mean it's good or true or correct, but like your taxes are wrong. It's incorrectly done. Even if you're like, well, that's what my taxes are, but you filled out the form wrong, right? So it's a little bit of a slight difference. It's still pretty kind of orderly. It's still kind of coming from that perspective, but it's not so much about necessity. It's about form, which is a little bit different. If this last answer is the right one, it at once creates a further problem for us to see how and why proper procedure demands the adoption of a simple geometrical shape and how that shape guarantees in its turn the validity of our procedures. Supposing valid arguments can be cast in a geometrically tidy form, how does this help to make them any more cogent? These are the problems to be studied in the present inquiry. If we can see our way to unraveling them, their solution will be of some importance, particularly for a proper understanding of logic. But to begin with, we must go cautiously. It's like, I feel like you've been going cautiously so far. But if you imagine that you're a logician, this is a guy who's like, we need to reevaluate what we've been doing for our whole professional careers. So if you think about his audience, he might be seeming quite radical here, where you're like, oh my God, this is so boring. I'm not saying I feel that way. I might feel that way a little bit. Keeping our eyes on the categories of applied logic, on the practical business of argumentation, that is, and the notions it requires us to employ, we must ask what features a logically candid layout of arguments will need to have. The establishment of conclusions raises a number of issues of different sorts, and a practical layout will make allowance for these differences. Our first question is, what are these issues, and how can we do justice to them, all in subjecting our arguments to rational assessment? Two last remarks may be made by way of introduction, and the first of them simply adding one more question to our agenda. Ever since Aristotle, it has been customary, when analyzing the microstructure of arguments, to set them out in a very simple manner. They have been presented 3 propositions at a time: minor premise, major premise, so conclusion. So here he's talking about the kind of classical syllogistic form that does come from Aristotelian logic. And this was like a huge deal. I remember one time kind of teaching syllogism in a class, maybe an argument class, and someone was like, why is this stuff such a big deal? Why did it matter so much? Which I thought was a great question. And I don't think I ever answered it to my own satisfaction. But I was like, well, for a really long time, at least in the kind of Western context, in the contexts where people were responding to or deriving their logic from something that Aristotle wrote, this was how anything could be logical. It must be able to kind of appear in that form in some way. There's a lot more variety in Aristotle's works than it might appear, because he has, he does quite a bit with the syllogism that's not kind of just deductive reasoning. But this idea of a minor premise and a major premise somehow interact with each other to get to a conclusion was pretty much part of all of his ideas of the syllogism. So again, if we go back to that one, all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, those are 2 premises, right? So we're not claiming them as being anything other than, if we buy that and we buy the second one, well, then what else can we say? If we accept those premises, what else can we say? Then we can say necessarily Socrates is mortal, right? So usually a major premise was one that had a kind of broader condition to it. That's not always true, but had a broader condition to it. The minor premise is kind of more contained, right? The first one's about all men. The second one's about just Socrates. And then from that, we can kind of make a claim about Socrates being mortal, if all men are mortal. Okay. The question now arises whether the standard form is sufficiently elaborate or candid. Simplicity is, of course, a merit, but may not in this case have been bought too dearly? Can we properly classify all the elements in our arguments under the 3 headings, major premise, minor premise, and conclusion? Or are these categories misleadingly few in number? Is there even enough similarity between major and minor premises for them usefully to be yoked together by the single name of premise? So he's kind of saying here is like, when we do this, when we put them in these boxes, we're missing out on like huge important things that we need to study. And we've been doing this basically for a couple thousand years. We need something new, right? So this is kind of he's taking on a big tradition here, even if you might kind of be like, yeah, duh. It's a big, powerful tradition. I mean, it still isn't, to some extent, a powerful tradition. Light is thrown on these questions by the analogy with jurisprudence. And here, by the analogy with jurisprudence, he means the one he made. He's like, oh, we should think about it this way, as being jurisprudential and not geometrical, right? So the syllogism here is the geometrical side, the geometrical model. The one that he's going to offer is the jurisprudential one. This would naturally lead us to adopt a layout of greater complexity than has been customary, for the questions we are asking here are once again more general versions of questions already familiar in jurisprudence. And in that more specialized field, a whole battery of distinctions has grown up. What different sorts of propositions, a legal philosopher will ask, are uttered in course of a law case? And in what different ways can such propositions bear on the soundness of a legal claim? So he's kind of here imagining someone being a little bit skeptical, being like, well, why would it matter if we're in the law? Logic is logic. Love is love. This has always been and still is a central question for the student of jurisprudence, and we soon find that the nature of a legal process can be properly understood only if we draw a large number of distinctions. Legal utterances can have many distinct functions. Wouldn't you know? Statements of claim, evidence of identification, testimony about evidence in dispute, interpretations of a statute or distinctions of its validity, claims to exemption from the application of a law, pleas and extenuation, verdicts, sentences. All these different classes of proposition have their parts to play in the legal process, and the differences between them are in practice far from trifling. So I think here he's kind of trying to give you a reason why he thinks that this metaphor, this analogy, is more powerful than the geometrical one or the Aristotelian one that he's been working with. If you can see the differences between all of these things, he's like, you've already kind of recognized that legal argument or jurisprudential argument goes way beyond what we can do with major premise, minor premise, conclusion. Just we're missing out on all of this stuff. That these kind of function as different kinds of moves in a legal, logical game. But yeah, so that's kind of what he's saying, I think. When we turn from the special case of the law to consider rational arguments in general, we are faced at once by the question whether these must not be analyzed in terms of an equally complex set of categories. If we are to set our arguments out with complete logical candor, here again, candor kind of being clarity, and understand properly the nature of the logical process, surely we shall need to employ a pattern of argument no less sophisticated than is required by the law. And so here, this is his argument, right? If the law requires more distinctions to understand, and the law is one kind of argument, then all argument needs at least that much complexity to be understood. Okay. I kind of buy that. I'm willing to go along with him. The pattern of an argument, data and warrants. And here he starts introducing his own terminology. So you might think about data in a way that's, a little bit more familiar to you, where you're like, oh, data, numbers and charts and graphs and stuff like that. That's not what he's going to mean by data. And warrants, he's going to mean something really specific. So here it's kind of useful to understand when you're reading someone who is kind of working out their own vocabulary, both to remember your own sense of it, but also to kind of put that on hold and say, okay, I know there's going to be some kind of special meaning given to these words. These are going to be kind of technical terms here. Let me try to make sure I understand what they mean before I kind of fill in what I think it might mean. So here he's telling us these are going to be the technical terms, data and warrants. What then is involved in establishing conclusions by the production of arguments? And here he's in little quotes, right? He's kind of still having a conversation with this imaginary person. Can we, by considering this question in a general form, build up from scratch a pattern of analysis that will do justice to all of the distinctions which proper procedure forces upon us? That is the problem facing us. Yes, we're in it together, Toulmin. We're going to do it. All right. Let it be I kind of agree with this review that this is prolix and maddening prose. But, it has a kind of, you can kind of see someone maybe in a smoking jacket. He's kind of sitting down. He wants to invite you in, and it's the 50s, and, it's office hours, and you're going to kind of sit down and really have a nice long conversation about the nature of argumentation. It might sound like this. He's taking his time. He's being leisurely. It's very hot in this room, so I don't feel very leisurely because I don't have the AC on because it's too loud. But, I can imagine it's a cold Cambridge morning or something. Okay, and we're by the fire. If this claim is challenged, we must be able to establish it. That is, make it good and show that it was justifiable. How is this to be done? Unless the assertion was made quite wildly and irresponsibly, we shall normally have some facts to which we can point in the support. If the claim is challenged, it is up to us to appeal to these facts and to present them as the foundation upon which our claim is based. And that just seems kind of like, I think, common sense to a lot of people. Like, yeah, right? But that's not necessarily common sense from the logical point of view of the study of argument. Being challenged, like, who's challenging me? We're in logical world. So here he's kind of imagining a little bit. It's kind of half this abstract world where we're just dealing with arguments that are propositional. They're kind of written out. But also a world where we're kind of imagining there are other people who might like challenge us. So we have to do something there. And so the law is maybe a good way of thinking about that middle point between the kind of abstract legal thing and the fact that, yeah, there's real people involved. There's going to be different kinds of challenges and things like that. So I think that's the reason why jurisprudence becomes an attractive model for him. It's kind of halfway between the kind of wild world of argument where people kind of do whatever they want, and this abstract kind of highly rarefied hothouse of logic where things can only exist under these very artificial conditions. But this complication need only mention. Supposing the lemma to have been disposed of, our question is how to set the original argument out most fully and explicitly. So a lemma is a kind of formal term in logic for a kind of, let's just say, a premise. That's not really what it is, but okay, let's just say that's what it is. It's a formal term. Harry's hair is not black, we assert. What have we got to go on? We are asked. It's a kind of weird conversation that you're having. Be like, I think, don't you know Harry? I mean, what are we talking about? Our personal knowledge that it is in fact red. That is our datum. This is the singular of data. You know, sometimes people will say this. These data show. Well, it's because it's from Latin. So this is the singular. So here we don't have data. We only have one datum. We just know from our personal experience. The ground which we produce as support for the original assertion. Peterson, we may say, will not be a Roman Catholic. So that's the claim. Why? We base our claim on the knowledge that he is a Swede, which makes it very unlikely that he will be a Roman Catholic. So already that's kind of an interesting difference. Being like, okay, Harry's hair's not black, I know because I saw it. Versus, oh yeah, Peterson, he's not Catholic. Well, how do you know that? Did you ask him? Have you seen him praying at the Congregational Church or something? And he's like, no, he's Swedish. Well, so that's not exactly kind of a certain claim. But, and he's going to go into it, there's a warrant. There's a kind of reason to move between the evidence. Very few Swedes are Catholic, right? That's kind of how this stuff is going to work. Wilkinson asserts that the prosecutor in the court has committed an offense against the Road Traffic Acts. In support of this claim, 2 policemen are prepared to testify that they timed him driving at 45 miles per hour in a built-up area. Okay, so what's the relationship between offending the Road Traffic Acts and that? We don't totally know yet. You know, we might be involved in that. Oh, Peterson's so devout, yeah. All of the examples are so weird. They're so weird, and they're kind of arbitrary. So I'm like, you could have said anything, but he loves talking about Swedes for some reason. I don't know why. Maybe he was like he had just a kind of hankering for some salty licorice, and he was like, I wish I had my Swedish friend here. I was thinking about it. In each case, an original assertion is supported by producing other facts bearing on it. We already have, therefore, one distinction to start with between the claim or conclusion whose merits we are seeking to establish, C. So here's going to be his little bit of formalism, right? A claim is going to be the letter C, all right? And the facts we appeal to as the foundation for the claim, which I'll refer to as our data, D. But, you know, facts here kind of are weird. Remember one of the facts was, I know it. I saw him. So facts here has a kind of maybe broader distinction. If you were in my class and we kind of were talking about facts and you maybe got into that place where it was really hot and your head was spinning kind of thing. Well, here he's kind of just means it in almost a kind of not particularly philosophical way, even though he's a philosopher. He's just like, facts are the things we use when we are defending our claims. Whatever that stuff is, those are the facts here. So it's almost a kind of functional, you could say, or a procedural view of facts. And if no one would accept that as fact, then maybe it's not a very good appeal, so it doesn't work, right? So that's kind of what he's going on here. So when he's talking about data or facts, he's not necessarily claiming that it's true. You could be wrong. Maybe Harry has been dyeing his hair ever since you knew him or something, whatever. But that's the stuff you're appealing to. You're appealing to the data, to the facts. Literally, it means the givens. Who gave it? I don't know. Okay. So even after we have produced our data, we may find ourselves being asked further questions of another kind. We may now be required not to add more factual information to that which we have already provided, but rather to indicate the bearing on our conclusion of the data already produced. And this is, I think, kind of secretly, the really interesting stuff in Toulmin, he doesn't really announce. But this is actually a very interesting change to how we're thinking about it. And so when we're, again, in that kind of halfway middle ground, this jurisprudential model of argument between there being no people in the world, it doesn't matter, it's logic, it's always true, even if it were on Mars or whatever, and a kind of rhetorical, chaotic world of like, oh wow, I don't know, what was true yesterday, things changing, stay on it. Here, the nature of the argument can be distinguished based on an imaginary question you're being asked about. So it's kind of coming from, you could imagine, a judge who would be like, well, if someone was just, if you have the little kid version of it, you're like, well, why? Why is Peterson a Swede? Oh, I'm sorry, why is Peterson a Swede? Why is Peterson not Catholic? Because he's a Swede. Be like, well, why is he a Swede? Be like, well, it's because he's where he's from. Well, why is he where he's from? You're like, okay. He's actually not just imagining an endless series of questions of like, or how do you know that, right? It matters what kind of question it is. Is it a question about what evidence do you have to support this? Or is it a question about the relationship between the evidence and the claim? And so the changes in the kinds of questions, what the questions are about, tell us that we're in different parts or different kinds of forms of the argument here. And that's what's really interesting about the Toulmin model, I think. And I think most people think, really. Colloquially, the question may now be not what have you got to go on, but how do you get there? To present a particular set of data as the basis for some specified conclusion commits us to a certain step. And the question is now one about the nature and justification of this step. Supposing we encounter this fresh challenge, we must bring forward not further data, for about these the same query may immediately be raised again, but propositions of a rather different kind. Rules, principles, inference, licenses, or what you will, instead of additional items of information. Now, one of the things that's going to be weird here, and actually one of the things that the reviews that I read before really criticized him for, where they're like, well, if you go down this road, any statement could become a rule. Yeah, I mean, it depends on how it's being used. So the logicians really want kind of rules to be separated out. They don't want their peas and their mash to touch each other. They don't want rules and statements to kind of be in the same box. But in the real world, the kind of, the ways that we distinguish what's being kind of asserted and what's being, what's being asserted as a claim about the world and what's being asserted as a claim about the kind of rules of the world or the discourse that we're in, is not always totally, easy to distinguish, and really depends upon the pragmatic context that we're in. So there could be a claim like, if I was going to make the claim that most Swedes are not Catholic, that could be my claim for the argument. Let's say I'm in some kind of geography class or something, or I'm working for the Census Bureau or something. Okay. And then you can ask, well, what's my data for that? And I would say, okay, well, here's the historical kind of census on it. But if the claim is that Peterson is not Catholic because he's a Swede, now my claim that very few Swedish people are Catholic is a rule for that inference. It's being used differently. It's not being used necessarily as another kind of fact that proves that. That's a subtle kind of distinction. I bet there are better examples than the ones he provides, but that's the distinction that he's trying to talk about. So sometimes we're giving things in an argument as kind of rules of how we get to an inference, and sometimes we're giving things as evidence, and sometimes we're making claims. We're doing different things based on what people are asking from us, what we're being asked to defend, or imagining we have to defend. Okay, so our task is no longer to strengthen the ground on which the argument is constructed, but is rather to show that, taking these data as our starting point, the step to the original claim or conclusion is an appropriate and legitimate one. At this point, therefore, what are needed are general hypothetical statements, which can act as bridges, and authorize the sort of step to which our particular argument commits us. These may normally be written very briefly, in the form of if D, then C. But for candor's sake, they can profitably be expanded and made more explicit. Data such as D entitle one to draw conclusions or make such claims as such as C. Or alternatively, given data D, one may take it that C. To us, it's like, I mean, personally, I don't find it be very helpful to have these alternatives. But you could. The fact that you could write these rules in different ways and kind of specify them in slightly different ways, again, that's a challenge to a logical audience who's kind of like, they're sweating bullets now. They're like, no, what am I going to do about the paper I just published? I think most people would be like, yeah, those kind of mean similar things, if not the same thing. Propositions of this kind I call warrants. You're under arrest for argument. That's kind of what is the big idea that we're taking away here, that these warrants are really what make argument work for Toulmin. You have claims that are backed up by data, but that's not enough, because we're like, if someone's like, well, Harry's hair is black, how do you know? Be like, well, I like the color black. That might be true, but that's not support for that claim. And then we'd be like, well, then we'd be in an argument about how it relates. So you could say all sorts of true things and make totally invalid arguments, right? I could say only true things and make terrible arguments because the relationship between the things I'm saying doesn't go together in a way anybody would recognize. And so the ways that things go together that people recognize, those are called warrants. These are the rules of inference that are relevant to the field that we're talking in, to the kind of conversation that we're having, to the kind of thing we're writing. To pursue our previous examples, the knowledge that Harry's hair is red entitles us to set aside any suggestion that it is black. On the account of the warrant, if anything is red, it will not also be black. I don't think we have to even go that far. You say if someone's hair is red, but whatever. Okay. Some birds are both, whatever. But the very triviality of this warrant is connected with the fact that we are concerned here as much with a counter-assertion as with an argument. Okay, that's a boring one. That's what trivial means. They're like, it's obvious, it's boring. The fact that Peterson is a Swede is directly relevant to the question of his religious denomination, for as we should probably put it, a Swede can be taken almost certainly not to be a Roman Catholic. The step involved here is not trivial, so the warrant is not self-authenticating. And here's where it becomes interesting, right? I'm already freaking bored of Peterson so much. But what becomes interesting in terms of, the idea of argument that he has here is the relationship between evidence, or what he's going to call data, and claims is almost always, in any interesting argument, not obvious, or I shouldn't say not obvious, it's like not complete. It requires a leap. And it requires a leap that's about some rule that probably is not being explicitly stated in the argument. So if you're in my class, when you're doing your argument analysis, that's kind of the fun part of doing it, is you're like, well, what's the thing that's not being said? How much of that can I kind of like pull up here to see how it's working? And sometimes when you do that, the fascinating thing is you might kind of nod along to an argument about stuff that's happening, but then you start examining it and you look at, well, what would the warrant be? And be like, oh, that's actually not very convincing. Once I think about it, it looks a little bit different. So that's part of the power of the Toulmin method, is that it makes us kind of focus on the parts of an argument, but also the part of an argument that's not said. That there's something that's kind of implicit, usually, until somebody kind of really demands it from you. Likewise, in the third case, our warrant will now be some such statement as that, a man who is proved to have driven at more than 30 miles per hour in a build-up area can be found to have committed an offense against the Road Traffic Acts. So if you remember, the evidence here was some cop got him on a 45, going 45 miles per hour. So be like, okay, you violated the law. Well, how's that evidence? The law says 30 miles per hour in this area. Okay. Again, this seems relatively simple. It's going to get a little bit more complex, but that's kind of what we're talking about. The question will at once be asked, how absolute is this distinction between data on the one hand and warrants on the other? Will it always be clear whether a man who challenges an assertion is calling for the production of his adversary's data, or for the warrants authorizing his steps? Can one, in the other words, draw any sharp distinction between the force of the two questions? What have you got to go on, and how did you get there? Look at this double question mark. You rarely get these in the wild, isn't that nice? By grammatical tests alone, the distinction may appear far from absolute. And the same English sentence may serve a double function. It may be uttered, that is, in one situation, to convey a piece of information, and another to authorize a step in argument. So that's kind of what I was doing before when I was going into the thing about Swedes not being Catholic, right? That could be a claim, or it could be a warrant, or it could be data, right? It depends on how it's being used in the particular argument that you're in. All these possibilities will be illustrated before too long. Thank God. Thank you, Toulmin. For the moment, the important thing is not to be too cut and dried in our treatment of the subject, nor to commit ourselves in advance to a rigid terminology. At any rate, we find it possible in some situations to distinguish clearly two different logical functions. And the nature of this distinction is hinted at if one contrasts the two sentences. Whenever A, one has found that B. Okay, and again, these letters just stand for anything, whatever, right? They're just forms. Whenever A, one has found that B. And whenever A, one may take it that B. So here you might say, like, this is a kind of strong claim or rule about the nature of something. Like, what is the case? And this is a kind of rule about how we might assume things are. It's kind of a little bit weaker. But it might sound in natural language exactly the same. Be like, oh yeah, we can do that. We can do that could be like, we can physically move in space and time. Or we can do that mean like, yeah, we can kind of draft a proposal. Like, not the same kind of ideas exactly, but they sound the same. Okay. We now have the terms we need to compose the first skeleton of a pattern for analyzing arguments. We may symbolize the relation between the data and the claim in support of which they are produced by an arrow, and indicate the authority for taking the step from one to the other by writing the warrant immediately below the arrow. So here's the data, so claim, since W. And I actually like that they put it in the Purdue one, they put the warrant above. But I think, I have to give it to Toulmin here. It's better that it's below. Because we have the kind of metaphorical intuition that things that are implicit are kind of below the surface. It's the part of the iceberg that you don't see, right? So the warrants are usually implicit. Not always, but usually. Harry was born in Bermuda, so Harry's a British subject, right? That would be a fine argument by itself. But the reason why is because a man born in Bermuda will be a British subject. And let's say you didn't know that. You'd be like, oh, well, why is that? I thought Bermuda was in the Caribbean. And someone's like, oh, yeah, but here's this kind of law. And maybe you need to know a little of the colonial history to understand why that is, da-da-da-da. As this pattern makes clear, the explicit appeal in this argument goes directly from the claim to the data. Really from the data to the claim, whatever, it doesn't matter, relied on as a foundation. The warrant is in a sense incidental and explanatory, its task being simply to register explicitly the legitimacy of the step involved, and to refer it back to the larger class of steps whose legitimacy is being presupposed. So why does that matter? We'll compare that to the syllogistic model. You can't go from all men are mortal, therefore Socrates is mortal, in the syllogistic model. You just can't do it. It's not allowed. There was a kind of, in classical logic, the Stoics did have a kind of model for doing something like that. But we're not getting that technical into all this stuff. But in the syllogistic model, it actually really matters that all of these things are explicitly stated. And so here he's like, no, that's putting us in the wrong frame of mind about what these things are doing. This is just telling us about legitimacy. It's not telling us about necessity. It's not telling us about a kind of rule of inference that universally works. This itself is a rule of inference that works because of this. Okay? It's a subtle difference. It's a subtle difference, but it ended up being really influential. This is one of the reasons for distinguishing between data and warrants. Data are appealed to explicitly, warrants implicitly. In addition, one may remark that warrants are general, certifying the soundness of all arguments of the appropriate type, and have accordingly to be established in a quite different way from the facts we produce as data. This distinction between data and warrants is similar to the distinction drawn in the law courts between questions of fact and questions of law. And the legal distinction is indeed a special case of the more general one. We may argue, for instance, that a man whom we know to have been born in Bermuda is presumably a British subject simply because the relevant laws give us a warrant to draw this conclusion. Be like, yeah, duh, that's what the law says. Why did you come to this legal court if you didn't know that? One more general point in passing. Unless in any particular field of argument we are prepared to work with warrants of some kind, it will become impossible in that field to subject arguments to rational assessment. So, let's try to make this a little bit more interesting. Imagine being a philosopher. And you're like, reasoning is all about logic. And logic is all about kind of, being very precise and making everything kind of appear clearly. And Toulmin kind of comes along and says, actually, if you want to assess the world rationally, you have to deal with warrants. And what are warrants? They're the things that do not appear clearly, that are not explicitly stated. They're implicit. Huh. So, okay, that's why this is kind of weird. One of the reasons why it's weird for some people at the beginning of argumentation studies, as we kind of know or come to it. Not the beginning, but whatever. The data we cite if a claim is challenged depend on the warrants we are prepared to operate with in that field. And the warrants to which we commit ourselves are implicit in the particular steps from data to claims we are prepared to take and to admit. So we don't kind of begin, when we meet somebody, like, okay, before we start talking with each other, let's lay out all of the possible things that we could agree to of the ways that we could reason about anything we might talk about, right? That would be like that's a torturous imagination, even to think about. But there are those kinds of things, and they might come from, hey, we're both alive, or hey, we both speak the same language. But they might come from more technical things like, hey, we're both lawyers, right? We're kind of both in this particular field. Or, hey, we're kind of doing something technical together, kind of both in a scientific laboratory. So certain things apply and hold as assumptions only in certain particular institutional or sociological or discursive spaces. Only hold sometimes. They don't hold all the time. But supposing a man rejects all warrants, whatever authorizing, say, steps from data about the present and past to conclusions about the future, then for him rational prediction will become impossible. You're like, well, I don't believe the sun will rise tomorrow. Well, why not? Be like, I don't know what's happening tomorrow. What about all the other times? I don't know, things could change. Be like, okay, well then, there's not much we can go on here. You're kind of committed to irrationality in that way, even though you sound, like you know what you're talking about. And many philosophers have, in fact, denied the possibility of rational prediction just because they thought that they could discredit equally the claims of all past and future warrants. So this is an argument happening among philosophers. I don't think it's that interesting, personally. The skeleton of a pattern which we have attained so far is only a beginning. Further questions may now arise, to which we must pay attention. Warrants are of different kinds, and some may confer different degrees of force on the conclusions they justify. So force here is going to mean something like, yeah, that's very probably the case, or like, oh yeah, that might be the case, or oh, it seems reasonable to consider that is the case. That's the level of force we're talking about. Some warrants authorize us to accept a claim unequivocally, given the appropriate data. If the glove fits, you must acquit. These warrants entitle us in suitable cases to qualify our conclusion with the adverb necessarily. Others authorize us to make the step from data to conclusion either tentatively or else subject to conditions, exceptions, or qualifications. In these cases, other modal qualifiers, such as probably and presumably, are in place. So I've gotten interested in mushroom foraging, and you might say, like, look, if this mushroom on the stipe, that stem, has this little kind of ring around it, it's probably an amanita. But it might not be, because there are other ones that also have that little ring around them. But it's probably that one, given that, it's in North America, it's in these conditions, and maybe look for all these other things. But it's never going to be certainly that way, because it could be another one, right? So how much that evidence is going to support that kind of claim, like, oh, this is an amanita, because it has a ring around it. That's not going to be certain evidence of it, and probably very little could ever give you totally certain evidence of it, even if you're kind of doing serious scientific research, because things could change. Like, oh, actually, we thought that was one species and now it's two, or whatever. It may not be sufficient, therefore, simply to specify our data, warrant, and claim. We may need to add some explicit reference to the degree of force which our data confer on our claim in virtue of our warrant. In a word, we may have to put in a qualifier. And that's just those kinds of things. Probably, plausibly, reasonably, necessarily, imaginatively, for the sake of argument. There's lots of different kinds of qualifiers. Again, it is often necessary in the law courts not just to appeal to a given statute. I think it's supposed to be statute, not statute. You could appeal to a statute in the law, but it's probably not going to be a great argument. Depends on the statute. Or common law doctrine. But to discuss explicitly the extent to which this particular law fits the case under consideration, whether it must inevitably be applied in this particular case, or whether special facts make the case an exception to the rule or the one in which the law can be applied, only subject to certain I'm thinking of Don Giovanni now, Steve. I'm like, there might be a few law courts that have a statute that kind of comes in. If we are to take account of these features of our argument also, our pattern will become more complex. Modal qualifiers, so here he's going to give it the letter Q. Modal means these things like necessity, probability, actuality. There are others, For me, I like to think about modality in this really broad way. I appealed to the thinker, and he's still really considering it. Yeah. Modality are these kinds of questions or these qualifications of force, you could say. I think modality is really, really interesting, actually. It's the part of logic, like, when I get interested in logic, this is the stuff I get interested in. Because there's one of the modality could be believability or knowability or things like that. And so more contemporary philosophers like this guy, Jaakko Hintikka, who's a Finnish guy, has kind of developed formal tools to study these modal ideas. So there's a kind of whole branch of logic that studies modal logic. But here he just means it in the kind of everyday sense. Be like, oh, that's probably the case. It might be the case. 50-50, things like that. And conditions are of exception or rebuttal. Be like, it's necessarily the case unless, right? That's not the same thing as probably. If I say it's probably the case, it's different than if I say it's necessarily the case unless this other thing is true. Are distinct both from data and from warrants, and need to be given separate places in our layout. Just as a warrant W is neither a datum nor a claim, since it implies in itself something about both D and C, namely that the step from one to the other is legitimate. So in turn, Q and R are themselves distinct from W, since they comment implicitly on the bearing of W on the step. Qualifiers, indicating the strength conferred by the warrant on the step. Conditions of rebuttal, indicating circumstances in which the general authority of the warrant would have to be set aside. Okay, it's getting a little bit, it is verbose, I think. To mark these further distinctions, we may write the qualifier, Q, immediately beside the conclusion which it qualifies, C. So here's the little diagram. All right, we're just going to skip this. We can look at the diagram. Data, so, probably, unless R, conclusion. And then the warrant is here. Here's the reason why we can do that. And then he gives us an example. Harry was born in Bermuda, so presumably, Harry's a British subject, unless both his parents were aliens or he became a naturalized American or something like that. We'll be like, oh, I didn't think of that. That's a good point, right? Well, what if he changed his citizenship status? This is not a certain thing. Harry's born in Bermuda, so he's a British subject. Here, presumably, is the qualifier, right? This is not even the same thing as probably. It's like, presumably. Unless there's some other thing that we would need to know. And then here is the warrant, since a man born in Bermuda will generally be a British subject. We must remark in addition on two further distinctions. The first is that between a statement on a warrant and statements about its applicability. Between a man born in Bermuda will be British, and this presumption holds good provided his parents were not born aliens, etc. Which is, I think that's the distinction between the the rebuttal claims and the warrant, but let's see what he says. The distinction is relevant not only to law of the land, but also for understanding its scientific laws or laws of nature. It is important, indeed, in all cases where the application of a law may be subject to exceptions, or where a warrant can be supported by pointing to a general correlation only, and not to an absolutely invariable one, which I would say is, even in the sciences where, it used to be thought that things were like pretty much kind of just purely deductive and rational mathematical. It is mathematical, but statistical modeling has become, for most sciences, a large, if not a kind of the exclusive aspect of mathematics that you'd be using in a lot of the different sciences. So, it's changing. The view of science has to kind of change in light of the level of complexity that science can deal with now. Things don't look quite so certain in light of that complexity. And that's not to be anti-scientific at all. It's not an anti-scientific claim whatsoever. We can distinguish also two purposes which may be served by the production of additional facts. These can serve as further data, or they can be cited to confirm or rebut the applicability of a warrant. Thus, the fact that Harry was born in Bermuda and the fact that his parents were not aliens are both of them directly relevant to the question of his present nationality. But they are relevant in different ways. The one fact is a datum, which by itself establishes a presumption of British nationality. The other fact, by setting aside one possible rebuttal, tends to confirm the presumption thereby created. So one supporting the other. That's kind of what he's saying. I don't really, personally, I don't really think this distinction holds up very well under analysis. I think it's useful to have these distinctions that we can use to do various things. So here he's kind of defending this as like a strong model where he's like, yeah, this is the model that's going to work, unlike the one that I'm getting rid of. And I don't think that's maybe the best way to approach the Toulmin model. I think actually maybe the more generous way is to disagree with him and be like, Well, this can be a thing that can be useful to help us see, like again, he thinks it's the physiology. Like in an anatomy book, we get to see some things more clearly. If you open up a body, you cut up a body, like maybe you did in biology class, things are kind of messy in there. And the kind of clearly illustrated and nicely kind of distinct diagrams of the frog body or whatever is not what the frog body looks like inside. But once you have that nice distinct diagram, you can look inside the frog body, and once your eyes start to acclimate to it, you begin to recognize it, like, oh, that is the liver, that is the weird little frog liver or whatever. Okay. All right, this is the last paragraph we're reading because this is all that I assigned, just a short little piece of Toulmin. You're welcome. One particular problem about applicability we shall have to discuss more fully later when we set out a piece of applied mathematics in which some system of mathematical relations is used to throw light on a question of, say, physics. The correctness of the calculations will be one thing. The appropriateness of the problem in hand may be quite another. Right? Sure. So the question is this calculation mathematically impeccable? Impeccable means, is it flawless? Maybe a very different one from the question is this the relevant calculation? And I gave the trivial example before of saying, just kind of giving random facts that are true that don't really support what you're saying. And that question of relevance, from the rhetorical point of view, I think relevance is really richly and deeply interesting. How people make judgments about relevance, I don't know if there's any kind of final criterion that can be used, but that's kind of what Toulmin also thinks. And so it kind of depends on the field that you're in. And for him, fields don't just mean kind of academic fields. It can be lots of different kinds of discourses that might be different everyday discourses, the discourse of working together with people versus the discourse of kind of criticizing each other's political opinions or whatever. What's relevant to an argument is a judgment that people are making amongst themselves, and we might not make it the same way. So then we're in argument in that way. But it's an argument there that for him it's about, in his terminology, an argument about the warrants of our arguments rather than about the kind of factual basis of our claims. We can move between that. So I could say to you both, like, I don't believe what you're saying, but even if I did, I don't think it would support your argument. And there I'm kind of making a challenge both at the data, the facts, and the warrants of your claim. I like that stuff about Eisenhower leading the Davis Cup for relevance. Oh, when it goes to the tennis example, yeah, when does that kick in? Go Coco! She just won the U.S. Open. His examples are quite strange. I think that some of the strangeness of the examples kind of comes from this. When you read these like Oxford, a lot of these Oxford people like Ryle. Actually, I assign a little bit of Ryle. They come from this kind of idea of what. If you were wearing a tweed coat all the time and you had a pipe and your idea of what kind of like natural language sounded like, it would be a little bit theoretical still. These wouldn't be the examples I would go with, but hopefully, even though they're kind of like 70 years old and from across the pond and a little bit Dawnish, the point that we get out of it is a little bit more clear after having done this. The major things that I think are important to take away from this is like, okay, here's the anatomy of an argument that I can use to look at any argument. It might not always look so clear with this perspective, but it might clarify some things. And the thing that I really like about it is the warrant part of it. The idea that arguments don't just exist in the explicit things that people are saying. That even from a logical point of view, you have to kind of assume something, and kind of working out what that assumption is, the relationship between facts and claims or data and claims, that's going to be a huge part of the study of argumentation. So that's the part I think is really interesting. Imagine he knows a heavy smoker who has a clubfoot, loves fox hunting, and writes crazy novels. Yeah, sounds about right. I haven't done this in a while, and I wonder if this was a good one to start with, because it feels to me like a bit dry and not quite as interesting as the others, and maybe my kind of bias showed through. But this is actually me getting over my bias. I actually kind of like Toulmin more and more as I keep teaching argument, because I think even though whatever I feel about his prose style or about the way that some of these arguments really tailored to a very different audience of philosophers than what I would be interested in mostly, I think that his art, he kind of strikes a nice middle position between lots of various ways of studying argument that can be quite serious and robust, but also kind of like useful to just try out. So I think it does a lot of nice things. It's good and hard to make a short reading on this stuff. Yeah, I agree. Yeah, I didn't used to do the kind of the layout stuff that we're doing here, but the warrant part I think is really important to get clear. So hopefully, if you're in class, we're gonna tomorrow. I think. I mean, this is going to date this video now, but tomorrow we'll kind of maybe look at some real-world argumentation and see if we can figure out how we would map those arguments, and especially looking for the warrants, and then kind of judge them that way. So that might be the way to do it. But let me know if you have other questions about Toulmin from watching this video. If you're coming to this on YouTube, throw a question in the comment, or tell me I got something wrong, or question the warrants that I have for the claims that I've made, or whatever. Ask me, what do you have to go on, or how did you get there, knowing that those are two separate questions now. That's pretty much all I have for tonight. Thanks for coming to the Rhetoric Prof stream. These are now going to become much more frequent. So if you like this, then follow this channel and you'll get an update when I go live. Or you can alternatively follow, come into the Discord if you're not in the Discord, and I'll post some events there when I intend to do one. But thanks for stopping by. And I hope to see you again in the future. Take care. Have a good rest of the night.